Barron Trump's day had started like any other. He had returned to New York for the holidays, hoping for a quiet break from the relentless spotlight that often followed him. His bodyguard drove him through the bustling streets of Manhattan, the towering buildings casting long shadows over the pedestrians rushing below. Barron gazed out of the tinted window, observing the chaos of city life. He had always found New York fascinating, its energy unmatched, its stories endless. As the car slowed to a stop at a red light near a busy intersection, Barron's attention was drawn to a figure sitting by the sidewalk. The woman sat hunched over, wrapped in layers of tattered clothing, holding a small cardboard sign that read, "Homeless. Please help." Her hair was matted, her face weathered, and her eyes heavy with despair. Barron couldn't look away. There was something hauntingly familiar about her. He squinted, trying to place her face. Then it hit him like a jolt of electricity. This wasn't just any stranger. This was Mrs. Fletcher, his middle school history teacher. Mrs. Fletcher had been one of the most influential figures in Barron's early life. She had a way of teaching history that made the past come alive, turning dusty textbooks into gripping narratives. In her classroom, Barron had learned more than facts and dates. He had learned about courage, perseverance, and empathy. She had often stayed after school to help him with assignments, encouraging him to think critically and never settle for mediocrity. And now, here she was, sitting on the cold pavement, clutching a sign that spoke of desperation. "Stop the car," Barron said suddenly, his voice firm yet tinged with urgency. The bodyguard turned to him, hesitant. "Sir, it's not safe to—" "Stop the car," Barron repeated, this time more insistently. The vehicle pulled over to the curb, and before anyone could stop him, Barron stepped out. The winter air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His focus was solely on the woman across the street. He approached her slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he got, the more he could see the lines of hardship etched into her face. Her once bright eyes were dim, her shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world rested upon them. "Mrs. Fletcher?" he said softly, crouching down to her level. She looked up, startled. For a moment, her eyes narrowed in confusion, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Then recognition flickered across her face. "Barron?" she whispered, her voice shaky and disbelieving. "It's me," Barron confirmed, his tone gentle. Her hands trembled as she pulled the layers of her coat tighter around her. What are you doing here?" "I should be asking you the same thing," Barron replied, his throat tightening. "What happened to you? How did you end up here?" Mrs. Fletcher let out a shaky sigh, her eyes welling with tears. "Life happened, Barron. After I left teaching, everything fell apart. My husband got sick, cancer. The medical bills drained everything we had. After he passed, I couldn't keep up with the mortgage. I lost the house, and eventually, I ended up here." Barron felt a lump rise in his throat. Hearing her story was like a punch to the gut. This was the woman who had once dedicated her life to shaping young minds, who had always been a pillar of strength in his eyes. Seeing her like this was almost too much to bear. "You don't deserve this," he said, his voice firm. "This isn't right." Mrs. Fletcher gave him a sad smile. "Sometimes life doesn't give you a choice." "Well, I'm going to change that," Barron said, determination hardening his voice. She shook her head, a look of doubt crossing her face. "Barron, I appreciate the sentiment, but—" "No buts," he interrupted. "You helped me when I needed it most. Now it's my turn." He stood and pulled out his phone, calling his driver to return. "Come on," he said, extending a hand to her. "You're coming with me." Mrs. Fletcher hesitated, glancing at the crowd of people passing by. "I don't want to be a burden," she said quietly. "You're not a burden," Barron assured her. "You're family to me." With a mixture of hesitation and hope, Mrs. Fletcher took his hand. As Barron helped her into the car, he made a silent vow to himself. He would do everything in his power to help her get back on her feet. Little did either of them know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. As the car pulled away from the busy intersection, Mrs. Fletcher sat silently, staring out of the window. Her fingers clutched the tattered bag she had with her, and though she had agreed to go with Barron, she still looked uncertain, as though this was all a dream that could disappear at any moment. Barron sat beside her, his mind racing with thoughts. He knew his parents, especially his mother, would be supportive of his decision, but he still felt the weight of responsibility. Mrs. Fletcher wasn't just someone from his past, she was someone who had helped shape who he was. Now it was his turn to repay that kindness. They arrived at a 5-star hotel in Midtown Manhattan, and as the doorman opened the car door, Mrs. Fletcher hesitated. "Barron," she said softly, glancing at the grand entrance. "I can't. This is too much." "You deserve this," Barron replied, his voice steady but kind. "It's just for tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure everything out together." With a small nod, she stepped out of the car, her worn shoes barely making a sound on the polished pavement. Inside, the lobby was a world of luxury. Chandeliers glittered overhead, and soft music played in the background. Mrs. Fletcher looked overwhelmed, but Barron gently guided her to the front desk, where he arranged for a room. Once they were upstairs, Mrs. Fletcher stood in the center of the suite, her eyes taking in the opulent surroundings. The plush bed, the elegant furniture, the view of the city skyline. It all felt surreal. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to," Barron replied, setting her bag down by the door. "You helped me more than you know, Mrs. Fletcher. Now it's my turn to help you." She smiled faintly, though her eyes still held a trace of doubt. "It feels strange being on the receiving end of kindness like this. I'm not used to it." "Well, you better get used to it," Barron said with a grin. "This is just the beginning." He ordered room service for her, a hot meal that made her eyes water with gratitude, and then left her to rest, promising to return the next day. But as he walked out of the hotel, Barron couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't enough. The next morning, Barron returned to the hotel with someone very important, his mother, Melania. He had told her everything the night before, and she had immediately wanted to get involved. When Mrs. Fletcher opened the door and saw Melania standing there, she was stunned. "Mrs. Trump," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect—" Melania smiled warmly and stepped forward to embrace her. "Please call me Melania," she said. "Barron told me what you're going through. I'm so sorry for everything that's happened to you, but I want you to know you're not alone anymore." Tears welled in Mrs. Fletcher's eyes as she nodded, overcome by the kindness she was receiving. The three of them sat down in the suite's living area, and Barron and Melania began discussing a plan. They wanted to give Mrs. Fletcher more than temporary relief. They wanted to help her rebuild her life. "Do you have anyone we can contact?" Melania asked gently. "Family? Friends?" Mrs. Fletcher shook her head. My husband was my only family, and after he passed, I lost touch with everyone. It's just me now." Melania placed a reassuring hand on hers. "You're not alone anymore," she said firmly. "We'll help you, step by step." Barron chimed in, his voice filled with determination. "First, we'll get you proper health care and help clear any debts. Then we'll figure out long-term options, a new job, maybe even a new place to live." Mrs. Fletcher listened in stunned silence, overwhelmed by their generosity. She had spent so long struggling on her own that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have people care about her. Over the next few weeks, Barron and his family followed through on their promises. They connected Mrs. Fletcher with a lawyer to help her sort out the debts left from her husband's medical bills. They also arranged for her to see a doctor, ensuring she received the care she needed after months of living on the streets. Barron personally took on the task of finding her a job. He reached out to several charities and organizations in the city, eventually connecting her with a community center that needed someone to teach part-time. When he told Mrs. Fletcher about the opportunity, her eyes lit up for the first time in months. "Teaching again," she said softly, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. "I never thought I'd have the chance." "You're one of the best teachers I've ever had," Barron said with a smile. "They'll be lucky to have you." As Mrs. Fletcher settled into her new role at the community center, she began to rediscover a part of herself she thought was lost forever. The first day she walked into the small, brightly lit classroom, she was greeted by eager young faces, curious and full of potential. The children at the center came from diverse backgrounds, many facing struggles of their own. It reminded her of why she had fallen in love with teaching in the first place. Making a difference, one student at a time. Barron visited her after her first week on the job. He found her sitting at one of the small desks in the classroom, grading papers with a look of contentment on her face. "How's it going, Mrs. Fletcher?" Barron asked, leaning against the doorframe. She looked up and smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her face in a way he hadn't seen since that day on the sidewalk. "It's amazing," she said. "I can't thank you enough for this, Barron. Being here, it feels like I have a purpose again." "You've always had a purpose," he said with a grin. "You just needed the right place to show it." Mrs. Fletcher gestured for him to sit down, and as he joined her, she shared stories about her students. The shy boy who loved history but was afraid to speak up in class, the bright girl who reminded her of herself at that age. Each story filled Barron with a sense of pride. He hadn't just helped her. He had helped the countless children she would go on to inspire. But life was far from perfect. Though Mrs. Fletcher was making strides in her new job and starting to regain her independence, she still struggled with the emotional scars of her past. Losing her husband, her home, and her sense of security had left deep wounds. One evening, Barron invited her to dinner at his family's residence. It was a casual gathering, just Barron, his parents, and Mrs. Fletcher, but she felt out of place in the grand setting. As they sat around the table, she hesitated to join in the conversation, feeling like a fish out of water. Melania noticed her discomfort and gently placed a hand on hers. "You belong here," she said softly. "We're so glad to have you with us." Mrs. Fletcher nodded, though her emotions were close to the surface. "It's just hard to accept help sometimes," she admitted. "I've always been the one giving, not receiving." Donald, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "Strength isn't just about standing on your own," he said, his tone surprisingly gentle. "It's also about letting people stand with you when you need it. That's what family does." Tears welled in Mrs. Fletcher's eyes, and she nodded, overwhelmed by their support. For the first time in years, she felt like she was part of something bigger than herself. In the weeks that followed, Mrs. Fletcher continued to flourish. With her debt cleared and her confidence restored, she began to envision a future she had thought was impossible. Barron, meanwhile, found himself deeply inspired by her resilience. One day, as they sat in the community center's courtyard, Barron brought up an idea he'd been considering. "Mrs. Fletcher," he began, "what would you think about starting a program here? Something for people like you, teachers, professionals, anyone who's fallen on hard times and needs a second chance." She looked at him, her brow furrowing in thought. "You mean, like, a mentorship program?" "Exactly," Barron said, his excitement growing. "You've been through so much and you've come out stronger. I think you could help others do the same." The idea lit a spark in her. Over the next month, with Barron's help, she launched the Second Chances Initiative, a program aimed at providing support, training, and resources for individuals looking to rebuild their lives. The program was a success from the start. Mrs. Fletcher used her own experiences to connect with participants, sharing her story of loss and recovery. Barron worked behind the scenes, leveraging his connections to bring in funding and expand the initiative's reach. At the program's first official event, Mrs. Fletcher stood before a crowd of participants, supporters, and community members. She held the microphone tightly, her hands trembling slightly as she looked out at the sea of faces. "Not long ago," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion bubbling beneath the surface, "I was sitting on a sidewalk with nothing but a cardboard sign and a bag of belongings. I thought my life was over. But then, someone reminded me that even in our darkest moments, there's always a light." She glanced at Barron, who stood off to the side, his expression proud and supportive. "That light can come from anywhere. A stranger, a friend, or even a former student," she continued. "What matters is that we don't give up on ourselves. And when we find that light, we have to share it with others." The room erupted into applause, and as Mrs. Fletcher stepped down from the podium, Barron was the first to meet her, wrapping her in a warm hug. "You've come so far," he said, his voice filled with pride. "And I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. The Second Chances Initiative went on to change countless lives, just as Mrs. Fletcher had changed Barron's all those years ago. Together, they proved that kindness and compassion could create ripples far beyond what anyone could imagine, and that no one is ever truly lost as long as there's someone willing to lend a hand.